You're watching your neighbor choke. His lips are turning blue. The bowl he just finished. Same ingredients. Same cook. Same stew you had yesterday. So why is he dying, and are you next? In the Middle Ages, the kitchen was never just a place to prepare food. It was a battlefield, a pharmacy, a trap, and for the unlucky it was an execution chamber. Forget what you know about food safety. There were no labels, no expiration dates, no real understanding of bacteria, fermentation, or toxins. Most people couldn't read, let alone understand what poison looked like. And yet, they had to eat. Every day. So they gambled. With mushrooms, with meat, with moldy bread and questionable cheese. And often, the price of a bad bet was death. This is not a story about gluttony. It's about survival. It's about how food, the very thing meant to sustain life, became a silent killer. Let's begin with the basics. What did an ordinary person eat in the medieval world? Not kings. Not nobles. But the everyday man, the plowman, the weaver, the apprentice. Their diet was humble, often stale, sometimes stolen, and more often than not, dangerous. Bread was the cornerstone of survival. Not soft, yeasty loaves, but hard, black, often mold-ridden slabs of rye or barley bread. In a good season, it filled the stomach. In a bad one, it filled the grave. Why? Because rye, a staple grain for peasants, was especially prone to a fungal infection called ergot. Invisible, tasteless, and deadly. Ergot poisoning didn't always kill instantly. Sometimes it started as tremors, hallucinations, convulsions. Other times it led to gangrene, where fingers and toes blackened and fell off. Entire villages were known to go mad for weeks before anyone realized their bread was laced with poison. And still they kept eating. What choice did they have? Water was often polluted. Wine and ale diluted with who knows what were barely safer. So people drank what they had ate, what they could find, and prayed they'd live another day. In that world, food wasn't just nourishment. It was Russian roulette. Every bite. A trigger pull. Now imagine you're not a peasant. You wear fur. You dine by candlelight. You sit beneath wooden beams in a great hall as servants pour wine into your silver goblet. You are a noble, privileged, powerful, safe, but not from your own dinner. Because while the poor risked death from spoiled barley or swamp water, the elite faced a different threat, one far more deliberate. Poison. In the medieval courts of Europe, food was a weapon. Not in the hands of assassins, but of chefs, cupbearers, and courtiers with a grudge. Venetian powder. Crushed pearls. Tinctures of arsenic dissolved in wine. The deadliest recipes were written not in cookbooks, but in whispers. And the richer your table, the higher the risk. Roast swan stuffed with dates and cinnamon. Pies laced with saffron and powdered gold. exotic fish brought in from the coasts already turning soft by the time they arrived. These dishes dazzled and sometimes destroyed. But not all danger came from sabotage. Even the normal food of nobles was hazardous, precisely because of how rare and overindulgent it was. Preserved meats were cured with saltpeter or lead-based glazes chemicals we now know are toxic. Fruit was often sweetened with honey fermented into alcohol, which, when mixed with certain metals, became a slow degenerative poison. And then there were the spices: cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. Imported from far-off lands, expensive beyond reason. To cut costs, merchants laced them with brick dust, wood ash, or dye powders made from heavy metals. So, when the Duke raised his goblet to toast the future, he may have been sipping it for the last time. What's worse, most nobles had food tasters. But those tasters only lived to detect fast-acting poison. The slow ones. They crept into your body quietly week after week until your liver failed or your mind unraveled. Elegance was an illusion. Behind the velvet curtains, medieval dining was just as lethal as a battlefield. The woods offered promise. Wild berries, fresh mushrooms, roots, herbs, and leafy greens. For the rural poor, foraging wasn't just an option, it was survival. But every leaf held a question. Is it food or a toxin? The medieval peasant didn't have a field guide. No color-coded charts. No Latin classifications. They relied on memory, on rumor, on superstition. And sometimes they guessed. Guess wrong, and you'd be buried by nightfall. Take mushrooms, for instance. Some varieties, plump, fragrant, mild, were delicious and safe. Others, nearly identical in color and shape, could induce paralysis, seizures, vomiting, and internal bleeding. There were no warning signs. No smell. No bitterness. Just a quiet death hours after dinner. Even worse, some poisons gave the illusion of safety. Amanita phalloides, the so-called death cap, often caused a deceptive recovery after the first wave of symptoms. Victims would feel better right before their liver collapsed. But it wasn't just fungi. Nightshade berries looked like wild grapes. Foxglove leaves resembled edible greens. Hemlock could pass for parsley. These plants didn't always kill instantly. Some attacked the heart. Others, the kidneys. Some induced hallucinations that led to fatal accidents, falls, drownings, fire. There are stories, half-whispered, of entire families lost after a single meal. Of villages poisoned by a shared stew. Of children found cold and still beside baskets of beautiful deadly berries. And yet, people kept foraging. They had to. There were no supermarkets. No imports from safer climates. No organic label to trust. The forest was their pantry, their pharmacy, their trap. And the greatest cruelty. Sometimes the deadliest foods tasted the best. Imagine you're ill, a fever, nausea, blinding headaches. You go to the local healer, or priest, or barber surgeon. He listens and prescribes the worst thing possible: more poison. In the medieval mind, health was a balancing act. Not between bacteria and immunity. They didn't know those existed. But between four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Too much of one: illness. Too little: also illness. And the treatments, they weren't just ineffective. They were fatal. Bleeding, purging, forced vomiting, hot coals, animal dung poultices, blood-letting leeches attached to children, mercury mixed with wine, ground emeralds stirred into broth, and worst of all, lead and arsenic-based cures taken as tonics. These were administered to treat everything from indigestion to melancholy. A slow, daily drip of metal death. The patient would smile, feel calmer, sleep better, and within weeks collapse. Even well-meaning treatments turned against the body. Doctors warned against eating fruit because it was cold and moist. So people avoided apples and died of scurvy. They believed cheese caused madness, that vegetables could make you infertile, that bathing while sick would open your pores and let death enter. So instead of clean water and fresh greens, people were fed cooked blood-raw onions or crushed beetles wrapped in cloth. You weren't just poisoned by food. You were poisoned by faith in a system that meant to heal, but couldn't understand what truly made you sick. The result: entire generations died from remedies administered with care. And worse, many believed their deaths were just God's will. You wake up hungry. There's bread on the table, cheese wrapped in cloth, a bowl of broth beside a jug of wine. It all looks simple, familiar, harmless. But in the Middle Ages, every bite carried a secret. Bread could rot your mind. Cheese could stop your heart. Wine might dissolve your insides. Even the herbs in your soup, so lovingly picked, might shut down your liver by sundown. And what made it worse was that no one knew. No one meant harm. The mother feeding her child wild berries. The servant preparing a pheasant pie. The healer offering a powdered potion of crushed bone and honey. They weren't villains. They were just wrong. Dead wrong. In that world, eating wasn't just about taste or comfort. It was a negotiation with death every single day. The truly terrifying part: most of the killers had no smell, no warning, no bitter aftertaste. Just silence, then stillness, then a name whispered over a grave no one could explain. And if you had lived back then, if you had reached for that second helping, if you had followed the doctor's advice or foraged too deep into the forest, would you have survived your own dinner